Hello. Did PD just get out?
Yes.
Cool. All right. Let's go. You all can take a 5-minute break and we can start at looks like 2:08.
Thank you.
I'll put that in the channel as well. Whoops, you all aren't 2008 backend students.
Nope.
All right, so I just dropped it in your channel, but go ahead and take a 5-minute break and we'll start class at 2:08. Get started with class in about 1 more minute. All right, I am going to get us kicked off here. So we're going to be talking about authorization today. Yep, that's what it says on my slide. So we're talking about authorization. I'm going to have you start with a warm up here, and we're going to be doing some diagramming. The prompt that I have here is draw a diagram of how Rails works. So this is really general. I'm kind of using this class as an excuse to like do this full Rails app diagramming. I think this is a good point at roughly the midpoint in the mod for us to do something like this. So you're going to diagram the whole Rails stack. I've got some things that I would like you to include in your diagram. So client, server, HTTP request. All of the following should be labeled, or these words should appear somewhere in your diagramming. This is going to be a good starting point for us to talk about authorization, but I think this is also just a good check-in for us to kind of challenge our understanding of the Rails tech stack and how that works. So I'm going to give you all, let's say 10 minutes to do this. So until 2:20. So 2:20, I'm gonna show you my version of this. I also have 2 more questions at the bottom of this. I think most people, you'll spend the full 10 minutes. You'll spend the full 10 minutes diagramming that, and that's fine. But I at least want you to start thinking about these 2 questions. What's the difference between authentication and authorization? And how might we use namespacing that we talked about this morning? How might we use that for authorization? Does anyone have any questions? All right, so go ahead and take 10 minutes to work on those diagrams. And this can be a diagram on paper, it can be on the computer, doesn't really matter, but just use those drawing skills. Guess I'm still sharing my screen with you all. There we go. Got those instructions back up. We'll take about 6 more minutes with those diagrams. Two more minutes and then we're gonna go over this together. All right. So let's go ahead and go over this together. I think that this is a pretty good challenge for you all to test your understanding of Rails. So I would expect you to have some struggle with this, or like maybe there's some of those words that I put on the screen that you don't really know where to put them in your diagram. And that's totally fine. So I'm going to go over this right now. And if you have any questions, please just raise your hand in the participants and we'll get to them. So the first thing that I want to draw on my diagram is I want to draw my client and my server. And this is something that I've done for you all a couple times. So let's draw them really quickly. So I'd have like a client over here. So this is like my my user's web browser or something like that. They are using like Google Chrome or Safari or something to use my web app. And my web app is what I might refer to as the server over here on the right. So the client is going to send us something, and we are going to respond with something back. Can I get a volunteer from the crowd? These two arrows that I've drawn, how might I label them? What does the client send over to the server? And then what does the server send back in response? Danny?
The client sends a request.
Yeah, specifically, this is going to be my HTTP request. Yeah, right.
And then the server would send back like a display, like an HTML or CSS, maybe?
That is true. They are going to send us back HTML, but that HTML is going to be contained in something larger that we're going to send.
The view?
Not quite. So the view is going to create that HTML, but all of that gets packaged. If the client is sending a request over to the server, what does the server send back in response? Can I get another volunteer from the crowd? Dan.
It sends back an HTTP response.
Yeah.
Which contains HTML.
Right. So to Danny's point, where the HTML that we send back, the HTML CSS, is going to be part of the response. Specifically, it's going to be in the body. So in the body, we would have HTML, CSS, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, so we do send that stuff back in response. It's all just packaged up into this HTTP response. You can kind of think of it how if I want to send, back to the pen pal analogy that we talked about day one, if someone is going to send a letter to me, I am going to respond with like words and phrases and paragraphs, but those are going to be wrapped up in a letter, right? So the HTML and CSS, that's like the content, that's the words in the paragraph or whatever that we want our user to get back, but it still has to be packaged in a way that we can send back to the user over the, in the metaphor, it would be through the postal system. In our example, we're sending it through the internet. So we're sending an HTTP response back to the user. So this is great so far, but let's zoom in a little bit and let's talk about how this actually works with Rails. So I'm gonna make this stuff a little bit smaller here. So I'm gonna have my small client. They're going to send over an HTTP request to my server, which will make this a little bit smaller. And then we're going to send back an HTTP response. And that response is going to contain our body that has our HTML and our CSS, just like that. So you can think of your Rails app's entire job is to get to this point that I will circle. It's to get to this point. We are going to get requests to our app. All our app has to do is respond to requests. That's essentially all it has to do. Now, of course, we want it to respond in ways that are logical and allow users to actually do something on our app. So in Monster Shop, like we're trying to create an app that is an e-commerce app where users can buy things. So we want our app to do those things that logically allow us to do that. But at the core, a web app is just receiving requests and sending back responses. Dan, I assume your hand is up from before.
Yep, sorry, I'll take it down.
No, you're good. Okay, so what we really need to talk about is how do we get to this point? How do we generate that HTTP response? What is the first thing in terms of the rest of our vocab words that I had you all label? What's the first thing that our request is going to hit? What's the first thing in our Rails stack that needs to process this request? Can I get a volunteer? James.
Would it be the path?
Yeah, so we're gonna like process the path. We're gonna process the verb, right? But what's the thing that actually does that for us? Like, what's the file that does that? James, or if you want to bump to someone else.
Our roots file?
Yeah, exactly. We'll kind of draw that next over here, and let's just have it blue just for consistency. Yeah. Okay. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to take that request, right, and we're going to process that in the routes file. So James, you started saying it, but what are the two things that our routes are going to look at first when it comes to that HTTP request?
The verb and the path?
Yeah, exactly. So it's going to look at the verb and the path, that verb path combo. So get to slash puppies, post to slash users, something like that. It's going to look at that verb path combo. And then can I get another volunteer? Where does it route it to? Like, so we take this verb path combo, and then what do we point that route to? Phil.
To our controller.
Yep, to the controller, right? And then Phil, there's one other part in there. So we don't just go to the entire controller. We want to look for a specific part of the controller. What do you know what that part is?
Yeah, the action that is specified by our path.
Exactly. Yeah. So we're going to take that verb path and we're going to route it to, I'll draw it like this. Let me draw it first. So I might draw it like this, where I have this box that's the controller, and then I have a smaller box inside that controller that's my action. So this is like a method defined inside the controller. So I'm drawing that arrow going from the routes file to the specific action. So we take the verb path combo and we route it to a specific controller action. So then that action from there is going to rely on two other key parts. And this is where our MVC comes in. So our controller is relying on our view and our model right here. So let's focus in on the model first. So I will say that our model, the way that we would trigger something happening in our model from our controller, the way that we would actually call upon our model is that we would call model methods. So for example, if I have a pet class, I might call pet.all, I might call pet.where, I might call pet.find to find a specific pet, and then maybe I call more methods on that pet. But we refer to these models in order for us to call on those model methods. Can I get a volunteer from the crowd to describe how do I fit in active record and the database? Did I ask you to put the database in here? Yeah, so how do I put active record and database into this? Kira?
I actually had a question about this, so I'll just kind of answer and question as I go.
Sure.
So when you are calling the model method, it needs to go through active record
Yeah.
so that you are sent back Ruby objects.
Yeah.
So it's,
So
oh, go ahead.
no, keep going.
I was just going to say the active record is like the gatekeeper between the database and the model.
Yeah. So let me draw 2 boxes here. And then Kira, which one might I label active record?
The middle one.
Yep. So I'll just say AR for an abbreviation. And then what's the database then?
The one on the left.
Yes. And so let me draw a couple of arrows here. So let's kind of start at the end. Kira, what did you say that active record is going to return to us?
Ruby objects.
Exactly. Yep. So these are going to be Ruby objects, right? Let's draw the arrow from the model to active record. How do we sort of like trigger an active record call, Kira?
The model method. So like if it was .all, it'd be .all.
Yeah, and so .all is an example of a model method where that's like, we didn't write that method, right? Like we didn't write .all. So what actually, like what library actually like wrote the .all method?
So I believe it's the active record library that you are inheriting from in your model.
Exactly. So I might say that these are active record methods. So when you use an active record method like .where, .count, .all, .pluck, there's all of these built-in active record methods. When you call those active record methods, that calls on the active record library, and then that active record library will interact with the database. Kira, at this point, when active record is talking to the database, how is it talking to the database?
It's using SQL language.
Exactly, right? So this is going to be, once the active record is calling on the database, it's creating a SQL query. And then Kira, this one's a little trickier. What are we going to get back from our SQL queries?
That one I don't know.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and do this one. So this one is going to be SQL tables. I said this before in one of our in our joins class, but when we make a SQL query, we're always going to get back a table. You can also just think of this as raw data, but it is going to be in that like table format. So that's one that I would expect to be like kind of fuzzy for you. Okay, so now if we just zoom in on this, let me actually draw a circle around it. If we just zoom in on this part of the Rails stack, we can see like there's actually this rich interaction between active record, the model, and the database. So the model will use active record methods that call on the active record library, and that active record library translates those active record commands into SQL queries. Those SQL queries will execute against the database, which contains your data. That database will return to you your raw data in terms of SQL in the form of SQL tables. Active record will take those tables, translate them into Ruby objects, which then play nicely in our Ruby. That was a lot. Does anyone have any questions on like the database model portion of this? Yeah, Brett.
I'm gonna ask this question, but where do the params fit in? Yeah.
That's a good question. Brett, will you ask me that when I finish up?
Yeah.
We can go back and add some more stuff. Yeah. Phil.
I don't know how significant the answer to this will be, but I was trying to describe to a friend yesterday what active record is, and I found myself at a loss. What is active record?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that's something that I would want you to like continue challenging yourself to answer throughout the mod and into mod 3, because I think that notion of like try to explain it to a friend is a great way to test your own understanding and maybe kind of like fill those gaps. Active record is like, the technical answer is active record is an object relational mapper, ORM. And the ORM's job is to, just like in this diagram, sit in between our code base and our database, and it will translate, it has built-in libraries for us that will translate Ruby code into SQL queries, and vice versa, it will translate SQL data into Ruby objects. So it allows us to interact with our database through our programming language, through Ruby, without actually having to write the raw SQL. So an ORM in general will do that for you in other languages. It will allow you to interact with the database through objects, through an object-oriented language, rather than the raw SQL. Kira?
So if we were to zoom back out to the client-server relationship, the database is housed in the server or is represented by the server?
I will say that the server, up to this point, we have very much been simplifying for you all. I have done that specifically when I've drawn it before. If you think about the server in more technical terms, the server deals with like the under the hood communication between the client and your Rails app. So the server's job is to really deal with that low level like HTTP portion of things. So that's why we don't have to like interact with the HTTP portion of things directly. It kind of happens underneath the hood. That's the job of the server. So the server's job will receive the request, it will process the request, and it will hand off the relevant information off to the Rails application.
Okay, thanks.
And conversely, the server is responsible for sending the HTTP response back to the client. Angela?
Yeah, just following up on that. Like when I think of a server, I typically think of like a computer or like a set of computers in a room somewhere that store, in this case, like the way I thought about it is like they probably store my Ruby code with all this logic, like my MVC logic, and it also stores my database. But also it seems like in this diagram, the server is just receiving requests and serving responses. So is there a difference there, like between the computer that houses all the information versus this piece in this process that just like serves responses?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think you're starting to get into like the specifics that some of you all might know better than I am, especially if you have like an IT background. I think this gets kind of confusing because I think we use the word server to refer to two different things. So there is both the server that is the application that's running that handles what you're describing as the receiving the requests and sending the responses. There is also the physical computer, the thing that you could like pick up with your hands and hold in your hands that houses that running server, and that we also refer to the server. So it's hard to say exactly what you mean by server. In this case, I am referring to the code that is running that actually processes the request and sends the response. I'll ask you this just to make this maybe a little bit more concrete. We haven't talked directly about this, but what is the server that Rails uses? The actual like program that Rails uses?
Localhost?
Localhost, not quite. So localhost refers to the server, but it's not the actual running server. When you run, it's something that you might see when you type Rails S. You might see it's like the server is starting up. Any guesses?
Is it our Postico or Postgres?
Not quite. That's your database. Shout it out if you have a guess.
Puma.
Yeah, there you go. So we haven't actually talked about this, but underneath the hood, there is a program called Puma that is the like running server. So Angela, to answer your question, I might refer to the server Puma and the server, like what you're saying, the like big box that's running the code. Those are like two different types of servers. I might also refer to the physical server as like the server rack or just the rack. Because it's like these computers would actually be on like racks in a giant like server room. They would be on a physical rack, so sometimes they're referred to as racks. Yeah. Let me draw a couple more things on this diagram. You are asking some really good questions. This might turn up some new questions. So once we call on these model methods, let's do it in blue. The model is going to return to us, again, our Ruby objects in most cases. Now, depending on what your model method looks like, these could be different types of Ruby objects. These could be like the actual model objects themselves. So if this is a pet class, this might return pet objects, but this could also return other Ruby objects like strings. Remember, strings are just objects. So if you're trying to get a list of all the pet names, maybe this model method returns to you an array of strings, for example, but it's still going to return to you Ruby objects in some form. Excuse me. Let's talk about the view portion of this. When it comes to utilizing the view, the way that the controller triggers a request, it triggers the view to do its thing. We'll talk about what its thing is in just a second. But the way that the view is kind of called upon is with a method called render, which we've seen when we've talked about SAD paths. But render is implicitly called in all of your controller actions. So the actions where you don't have the render method called and it just renders the view, it looks in the folder using the naming conventions, the render method is still called, it's just called invisibly. So the render method is always called. And what the render method does is it tells the view to look through this ERB file, and anywhere it sees the ERB tags, it runs Ruby code and it does all that stuff to dynamically create your view. But when we actually create the view, what we get back from the view is our HTML. So at the end of the day, when the view is done doing all of its ERB tag stuff, it's running your Ruby code inside these tags and all that, it will just give you an HTML file. It'll just give you like this raw HTML. And what that is going to do is we're going to take that HTML, and now I'm gonna draw this in red because now this is the point where we're creating our response. So let me actually do this. So we're going to take that HTML. Let me draw it like this. So everything in red, this is the process of making the response. We're going to take that HTML and we're going to package it up into an HTTP request. And that's where we're going to get our HTML into our body. So that view that we had, it's going to create our HTML. We're going to take that HTML, package it up into our request, and send it off to our user.
So that's Brian.
Yeah, let's go with Phil first.
I'm just confused. I thought that was response.
Oh, yep, you're right. My bad. Brett.
So the HTML just goes straight to the server, right? Not through the action.
You should look at it more as like it's going through the action. Okay. The action, so in kind of the same way that the entire Rails app's job is to just make a response, the action's job is to get the HTML for the response.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is a good place to leave it. I think we added in every piece that I asked you to add in. Yeah, any other questions about this? Leah.
I have this question when working. Yeah, I had a question. Sorry, my brain's not working. When it looks like here, we're like communicating with the model and using the controller as the middle person between the view to actually call model methods. And it looks like you could do it either way. Like from the view, you could just call a model method. Is that not good practice?
Yeah, you could call a view. So imagine like this is my, imagine, I mean, I could just write it out here. So imagine like this is a pet class, and inside here, just type this out first. Okay, so you can imagine like this is our pet model, and inside this pet model, we have a method defined called good boys. And so there's no reason that I couldn't call, let's actually make this a class method as well. So self dot. There's no reason in my view I couldn't have some method call like this that would actually call that method.
Mhm.
And yes, you're right, Leah. That would then trigger this kind of interaction where we're calling directly upon the model method. I would say typically this is not good practice. So when we talk about like our MVC principles, this is one you want to avoid where the view is directly calling on, I will say class methods are the ones that you really want to avoid calling. Now, what about instance methods? Well, instance methods are a little bit of a different case because typically, how do we get instances into the view? We typically call something in our controller like pet.find or pet.all, something like that, that will give us those instances that then we pass to the view, which is a better, which is a better interaction because then it's kind of like we are calling on methods from the view, but we're still going through the objects that were passed to us through the controller. So it looks more like that.
Oh, okay. So class methods go through the controller, instance methods could just be called from the view.
Yeah, I think it's the other way around. Class methods you could call from the view, but you don't want to call them from the view.
Okay.
Yeah, this is I think this is a little bit hard to explain, and that's why I start pseudocoding a little bit. It's a little bit hard to explain with without actual examples. But I think if there's one like rule to take away, it's you want to avoid calling class methods in your views because it does trigger this interaction, this direct interaction between the model and the view.
Okay.
Angela?
My question's pretty general, but what parts of this are specific to Ruby on Rails apps versus just web apps in general? Like, is MVC a Ruby on Rails thing or a general web app thing?
MVC is a general web app thing. It is a architectural pattern that is used in a lot of web frameworks. So MVC, database, and ORM are all the general terms here. Any other terms like AR, so active record, that's the more Rails Ruby specific. If we wanted to generalize this out to web apps, I could just say ORM here. So in general, like the model will interact with the ORM, will interact with the database. And then for controllers, not every web application is going to have the notion of actions, of controller actions, but they will have some notion of controllers. Views are also going to be your generic, are going to apply to all web apps. And then I think routes is going to be, that's Rails specific. I think most web frameworks have a notion of routing, but they might not specifically call them routes.
Awesome, thank you.
Brett, I see you have a question. Let's take a 5-minute pause and we'll come back and then Brett will get to your question. So let's come back at 2:55. We'll give everyone another minute to get back on. Brett, do you still have a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering where the params still fits in.
That's right. Gotcha. Cool. So I'm gonna give everybody another 30 seconds to get back. And then I will talk about that. So Brett's question is, how do we fit params into this diagram? I'm curious if we can get a volunteer from the crowd. Where might you think you would put params into this? James, what do you think?
So I think our params are stored in our database, but we would get access to them through our SQL queries.
So that's not quite it. So the params, remember that the params are like, let's think about like what type of data we might get in the params. We will get things like if there is an ID in our routes, we might get that in our params. If there's form data. So James, the reason why the params aren't going to appear in the database is because the database tables are typically that's where we're storing the raw data that's kind of like powering our application. I don't know a good way to say this, but it's the data that it's not, I would say the params is more metadata. That's more of data that we need along the way to complete a request or do something specific, but the actual raw data is what's stored in the database. So the params we're going to get access to. Well, let me pose this question to the group. Where's the first place where we have access to params? Or when you think about params, like where do we have access to them?
Controller?
Yeah. So Danny, given that the params we access them in the controller, where might it make sense to label, and not you specifically, Danny, but if I could get a volunteer, if we get these params in the controller, where might it make sense to label them in our diagram? Like, where does it kind of look like they might come from?
Would it be coming from the routes?
Yeah. That's and you know, I think we start to, like, at a certain point we start to get into like specifics that aren't really important. But yeah, it's coming from the routes. I really wish that I could find my tool that would let me change my mouse. Where's my, is it this? No. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing and share again. I seem to have lost my drawing tools. Okay, they're back.
I don't think we can see your screen, Brian. It's like one tiny line.
Sorry about that. Okay, well, I don't know why this decided. Can you see it now?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, it's making me draw on the other screen now, but we're just gonna roll with it. Whew, this is a lot of work just to get those tools back. Okay, yeah. So this is going to send, yeah, I might put it right there. If I was gonna put it anywhere, I would kind of imagine them as like coming along as part of that routing from the routes file to the specific controller action. That's how I would draw it. I would imagine that the server, the Puma underneath the hood, is like reading the form input and is parsing the path and all that. But I don't really know exactly how it gets in there. But it comes with the it comes with our code right in the controller action. Any other questions from this diagram? Cool. Let's go ahead and talk about authorization. So one of the things in the warm-up, one of the questions that it posed was, what's the difference between authentication and authorization? Can I get a volunteer? Like what do those two words mean to you? Arike, what do you think?
I thought of authentication as prove to me you are who you say you are. And then authorization is like permissions granted.
Yeah, great job. Yeah, so authentication is really going to answer that question of who you are. So you need to like present your identification to me. You need to, as a real world example, like authentication is giving your driver's license when someone asks if you're over 21 when you order a beer, or it's entering your social security information in to identify yourself. So in terms of websites, this is typically like username and password. Identify who you are to me. Once the application knows who you are, okay, now what can you do? So authentication answers the question, who are you? Authorization answers the question, what can you do? So our strategy, and I'm going to use this diagram as a starting point, our strategy is going to be to prevent anyone from doing something that they are not allowed to do. And looking at my diagram, the place that kind of, the place to me that most stands out as where we can make that easy decision is right here at this point of us routing the request to a controller action. Notice how everything below, let me draw a squiggly line right here. Notice how everything right here in terms of the model and the active record and the database and the view, all of this stuff is only accessible after we get past the controller action. So our strategy is going to be at this point right here, in this first red line that I drew, let's make sure at that point that someone is authorized to do what they're trying to do. And if they're not, we can cut them off from everything else in the database. So that's accessing a certain view, accessing the database. We're going to cut them off before they even get to that point. The database is the key thing that we need to be worried about here. This is really the thing that we don't want anyone making any changes unless they are authorized to do so. So let me back up and just say that one more time. If we can cut someone off that's not authorized to do something, if we can kind of like filter out the fakers, filter out the hackers that are trying to hack our application, if we can filter them out in this controller action phase, we can prevent them from getting any of the really important stuff that's in our database. So that is our high level strategy. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take all of this stuff down here and just take it out. So we're not going to worry about the database and the view for most of this lesson. We're really worried about, can we, upon executing a controller action, can we determine who should and shouldn't be able to do something and prevent them from doing it right here in this controller action. Let me additionally take out this, actually, I could probably just leave in this HTML portion as well. Okay, so let's talk about the state of our controllers so far. So far in your application, when you've been executing these controller actions, now I do want to make this a little bit simpler. Let's just take all, we don't need to take out that part. We could take out this part. Yeah. Okay. So at this point, all of your controllers that you have been routing through look something like this, where we have our application controller. So the application is our our main controller, and all your other controllers inherit from application controller. So I'll draw those in blue. So let's just draw 4 like generic controllers here. So let's call this one, let's just call it generic controller 1. Make another one here, blah, blah, blah. Another generic controller. Sure. And all of these controllers inherit from your application controller. So all of these, okay. So that's what your current Rails applications look like right now. All of our controllers inherit from application controller, so they all inherit a lot of behaviors from application controller. What we're going to do next is we're actually going to make some more groups for our controllers to group them by who should and shouldn't be able to access them. So for example, what I might do rather than this is I might add another step in this inheritance chain. So let's draw it like this. Take these 3 out. And let's say that all 3 of these controllers that I've drawn here are some sort of admin controller. So you need to be logged in as an admin in order to use these. I'll say this is admin controller 1, controller 2, maybe this one down here is, we'll make this admin controller number 3, super creative names. So if you are not an admin, you should not be able to hit any of these controller actions and have them do what we want them to do. So what we're going to do is we're going to create another step in this inheritance chain, what I might refer to as an admin base controller. So for this base controller is now going to be the thing that inherits from application controller, and all of my admin controllers are going to inherit from this admin base controller. So now what I've done is I've added in another link into my inheritance chain. Rather than everything directly inheriting from application controller like this, now all of my admin controllers inherit from my admin base controller. So now my authorization strategy is going to be to add in a filter. And I'll draw the filter like kind of like a filter you might see in a spreadsheet, or it kind of looks like a funnel. I'll draw it just like this. Here's where I'm really missing my whiteboarding, so you could all see my drawing skills shine through. I'm going to add in a filter here. And what this filter is going to do is it's going to only allow logged in admins. If someone is not a logged in admin, if someone is not a logged in admin, we are going to, what I might refer to as, we're gonna bounce. This is where we're bouncing them out of the club. So you can think of this filter as like truly, it's like a bouncer, it's like a gatekeeper. It's like only allow you in if you are logged in as an admin. So they're standing right there, they're the bouncer, they've got the clipboard, they have a list of their admins, and they're gonna say, if you're not an admin, they're gonna say, hey, you're not on the list. hey, you're not an admin. And what this is going to look like so I might say like, we're gonna bounce them out. In technical terms, what we're gonna do is we're gonna show them a 404 error. So we're gonna show them a page that's gonna say like 404, we can't find the page that you're looking for. We know that it's because they're not logged in as an admin, but for that user who's just trying to access our application without being an admin or whatever they're supposed to be, we're gonna show them a 404 error that's just generic, we can't find what you're looking for. And we could implement this same strategy with other types of users. So we could say if someone needs to be a logged in user, we could make a user-based controller. If we say, we talked about in the project check-ins how you might have merchant users. If you're not a merchant user and you should be, we're gonna implement this same strategy. So that is like super, super high level, everything that we're gonna be doing. I'm gonna have you all work through the code by yourselves. But at a high level, does anyone have any questions about our authorization strategy? If there are things that someone should be able to do without authorization, so for those things that you should be able to do even though you're a visitor, we're gonna still use our same strategy where we have just our regular controller, and that controller, what would that be? Maybe this is like, maybe this is our items controller. This controller, we're not gonna implement an authorization before. So maybe someone doesn't need to be logged in to view all the items. We're still just gonna have our regular items controller that inherits from our application controller. It might also be the case that there are certain item things that you can only do as an admin. So then we might have, in addition to our admin items controller, or in addition to our regular items controller, we might have an admin items controller where this is all of the admin stuff that items can do. So maybe, for example, only admins can delete an item, but everyone can look at the items. Dan.
Quick question, and it's a little bit off topic, but does the client ever have access to see like how they're being routed or how they're being, or is that all hidden behind things like the client wouldn't ever have access to?
That's all abstracted away from the client. If you look at this diagram, in terms of the things that the client directly interacts with, it stops right here. It's only the HTTP request and response.
So they basically couldn't do something that would allow them to see things because it's all hidden away from them?
Yep. Everything, the routes, this application controller, MVC, the database, like all of that stuff is abstracted away from them. All they know is that they send a request and they get a response.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. You're welcome. All right, so I've been talking at you for a while. I dropped the first version of this diagram into your cohort channel, and I'm going to drop this second version in there right now. And I think it makes a lot of sense to me that this might not make a lot of sense to you right now. And as you work through the lesson plan, these diagrams make a little bit more sense. So I'm going to drop them in for you right now just so that you have access to them. I put, sorry, one sec. I put this in the slides, and I think some of you found already, but I dropped these slides into your cohort channel. I can go ahead and share while I talk about this. But really, this is the last thing. So we did the warm up here. The next thing is the tutorial. So with a partner, I want you to work through the code along section of this lesson plan, and I can drop this into your cohort channel as well. And I have 2 bullet points for you here. I do want you to read through and discuss all of the text in the lesson plan. I think that that is really, really important, and it has some explanations, and it might draw some connections between what we've talked about here together, or what I have talked about, and the code that you're actually writing. The other thing is that both of you should be coding. So I want you to, I'm going to put you in breakout rooms with a partner, but I really do want both people to be working through this. I'm also going to put you into, I'm going to pair you up with people in your project, just so you can start working with your project partners, because you are going to have to implement this in your project together as well. And then after you work through all of the code, I want you to answer the wrap-up questions. So at the very bottom, there are some wrap-up questions for us. I'm going to try and bring us together after 30 minutes and check in to see where everybody's at. If we haven't gotten a chance to work through all of the lesson plan, I think I might just have you continue to work on this for the rest of the day and post the answers to the wrap-up questions in the Code Help channel. Does anyone have any questions?
I do.
Go for it, Nico.
Okay, so I noticed that there is no user model, and but we're gonna use after, like down below, we're supposed to like add to it. So we just write it, or?
Gotcha. Yeah. So this lesson plan is assuming that you're working off of a working copy from the authentication lesson plan. So my guess is that we don't have set list updated with that code. That's my best guess. Did you all work through it? Did you all work through it on your own for the authentication lesson plan?
Yes.
Gotcha. Okay. So where did you all end with that? Did you all get to a place where you got that working? Let's do this. Can I have everybody in the participants panel, if you have a local working copy of set list with the code from the authentication lesson plan, can you give me that green check? Gotcha. So I don't have a ton of people who have that. What do we want to do for that? What do I want to do for that? Let's do this. Can I have someone hash? I just happen to be looking at yours. Can you I want you to PR your code. This might not be worth it. Yeah, I don't think this is worth it. I think the best thing to do is for if you aren't in a place where you have the code from the authentication set up, that would be the place for you to start. And I think I see some people. Grant, I just saw your comment in the chat. There's an updated repo in the lesson plan. Grant, what lesson plan are you referring to?
Today's, but I don't know that it's updated. It just says we will continue working in setlist. So pull down the most recent version of that here from the authorization in Rails lesson.
Yeah, yeah, I see that.
Setlist 1909.
Yeah, I see that version. The only thing is that probably has the version from, it looks like it has the authorization code in there as well. Yeah.
It's Rails 517 too.
Looks like Dan has a question.
Yeah. Dan has a question.
Sorry, that was
that was
old. Took it down. Thanks.
Cool. Yeah, 1909 is ancient. Yeah, I really think the best thing to do is for us to just start wherever you're at. I think that we're all going to be, like, you're going to have to work through this code at some point. I want you to work through all of this at some point. And so if you didn't get a chance to work through all of authentication, go ahead and start there. If you have started with authentication, or if you have finished authentication, go ahead and start with authorization. Yes, that is what I want to do. Okay. So let me put you into breakout rooms. Actually, yeah, let me put you in a breakout rooms. Sorry, y'all, I did not realize that that was going to be a hiccup for us, that we don't have a working copy to work off of. So I'm going to go ahead. I'm making these breakout rooms right now. So while I'm doing this, if you want to go ahead and look at your current setlist repo, and if you are on authentication, to start working there.
Hey, Brian.
Yes.
And if this is something I should work on later, then that's fine. But I just pulled down a new version of setlist, and I'm getting some errors already. Is that okay? Some tests not passing.
Possibly. I think it depends on what the tests are. Is
Okay.
it? Yeah. What are you getting?
One is a active record unique violation, and then the other one is just I think a model test is failing.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, those are probably related. I would try to drop the database and recreate it, because it sounds like your migrations aren't running. Is that right?
Yeah.
All right. So I've got breakout rooms with your project groups ready to go. So I'm going to put you in these rooms for 30 minutes. And again, I'm really putting you with other people so that you have someone to bounce ideas off of or to troubleshoot with. If you need any help and your group mates can't help you, just use the ask for help button. But I do want everybody to be coding during this on their own copies, wherever that may be. If you need to work through the authentication lesson plan, if you're ready to jump into authorization, that's fine. Yeah. Any last minute questions before I let you go? All right. All right, welcome back. So a couple of things to wrap up here. I think the first thing is just to thank you all for bearing with us through this really long day. I know we only have 1 hour free for you all scheduled all day. I think normally we would like for things to be more spread out, but with missing Monday yesterday, we kind of ended up with some packed in classes for this week. So thank you all for bearing with us. The other thing is, as I was hopping around breakout rooms, I saw people were really in different places. Some people were still making it through authentication. Others were working towards the end of authorization. And that's totally fine. What I will say that I said in a couple groups, and I want to make sure that I say it in front of the whole group, is that you will probably have to work through these lesson plans multiple times. And maybe not the entire lesson plan, but at least some of the code portions a couple times. I know that I certainly did to get this concept and to get what all the code is doing. So again, like, we worked on it a little bit today in class, but I would fully expect you to have to work on that. The first couple of stories, the first couple of sections that we talked about in the kickoff today do deal with authentication and authorization. So it might be the case that you don't really get to start coding until tomorrow, after you might take tonight to study those 2 lesson plans. So that is just to say, like, I think I saw a lot of people at different spots. So if you didn't quite make it through the lesson plan, or even start with the lesson plan, that's okay. I think it'll take like a little while for this information to really sink in. Yeah, I think that was the main thing. We're not going to go over the questions together because I think some people didn't get into the code today, and I don't think it would be very helpful to talk about code when some people haven't seen it. So we'll wrap up class here, but I will say that those check for understanding questions they're called wrap-up questions at the end of the authorization lesson plan. I think that you really should be able to answer those questions before you start coding. So some of the questions around what do before action filters do. I'm looking at the wrong lesson here. It's looking at the authentication lesson. Yeah, so the questions about what's the difference between authorization and authentication, why are they both necessary, what's a before action do, what's an enum do, what does allow any instance in RSpec do. I think that those are questions that you really should be able to answer. And I think that if you have questions, I would go to your group first to discuss those questions. So if you read through them and say like, I don't really know if I understand these, I think like trying to pair up with a group member of yours and going over those questions, that would be what I would recommend. Also posting an answer to, or a question in code help if you find out that you still don't have the answer to that questions, that's what else I would recommend. So that all is to say, like, use those checks for understanding questions to really test your own understanding. And if you find that you still don't understand those questions, find someone else to talk about the question with. We're not going to have a chance to address them in class. And I think that's everything. Does anyone in the crowd have any questions? Priya.
I've got a silly question for our Denverites. How many of y'all are looking at snow outside your window?
I don't think it's snowed for me yet.
I mean, there's snow coming down, but it's not sticking.
Yeah, it's just cold, a lot colder than it was, and wet.
It's just freezing rain here in Lakewood.
I'm in Lakewood
Oh, yeah.
too, and it's starting to stick a little in my neighbor's yard. I can see it.
It's
Still looking
98
like rain.
degrees over here, so but I can't go outside because like it's all smoky. So.
Thank y'all for indulging my silly question.
Did you say 98 degrees?
Yep.
Where are you?
San Joaquin Valley in California. It's just like super hot.
Word. Okay.
Yep.
I dropped the link for the survey to this class. If you all could go ahead and pop that open and take a minute to answer those questions. And once you're done with that, go ahead and head out, and we'll see you tomorrow.